I think most of you sent some statements about yourself and your experience and your desire with your registration or something, which I read through. And reading through that gave me a glimpse into what you're bringing into the space. And what I'm hearing in those are a few things. One, a longing for a church where what we say about God and what we experience in community actually line up, where people's lives are part of how we come to know the gospel. A desire to discern God's will in community, not just individually, alongside a deep concern about division and the loss of communal spirit. A call to stand in solidarity with people who are under attack, and the challenge of becoming a church where people truly belong across differences, across generations, and across abilities. And finally, the gap between preaching that is only academic and preaching that genuinely touches the everyday lives of the people in our pews. Does that resonate? So what I want to suggest today is that the way that I want to talk about preaching is not separate from any of these hopes and tensions that you bring. In fact, I want to suggest that preaching stands right in the middle of all of your concerns. The meeting place between people's experience of the gospel, the communal discernment of God's call, the work of remaining in relationship across disagreement and difference, and the challenge of thoughtful, informed preaching that's deeply tied to people's lives. So, with that in mind, let me begin with a claim. At its best, the sermon isn't something the preacher creates alone. In fact, I'd go further and say that the sermon isn't even something the preacher finishes on their own. And yeah, y'all have taken preaching classes, so you know that I'm making stuff up. But I ask you to bear with me. I have been an adjunct faculty member in seminary at not the Southwest, that's another one, at CDSP, and formerly in Berkeley. And what I learned about seminary formation in that role is that it encourages students to interpret texts carefully, to construct faithful arguments, and to speak with clarity and conviction, all of which matters deeply when it comes to the art of preaching. But even when we do all of these things well, something essential is still missing if the sermon is a closed act, a nicely wrapped package tied up with a bow before the congregation even hears it. Because if the sermon is something the preacher takes on alone, it risks becoming disconnected from people's lives. It can become a unidirectional form of communication. The preacher speaks and the congregation receives. And in the comments that you shared before we began, many of you have already named that reality. So I should say a word briefly. I've been talking about it already, but let me say a little bit more about where this is coming for me. As you know, I'm about to retire as the rector of St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco, where I've served since 2004. And I've been a friend of that congregation since 1997. So for almost 30 years, I've been learning from the people of St. Gregory's how the preacher and the congregation may form a relationship around the sermon. This is both a liturgical practice and a strategic part of formation and keeping our congregation's life together, which we simply call sermon sharing. So I want to talk a little bit today about the form of sermon sharing and about what this practice does to shape the congregation itself. So my claim is that sermon sharing has the power to shift our understanding fundamentally what preaching is, and also changes how preaching builds up the life of the church, which happens on the basis of a theological claim that we take seriously at St. Gregory's, which is that God is already speaking in the lives of the people in the pews. Not just in Scripture, not just in tradition, but in the lived experience of the assembly as a whole and of its members. And if that is true, then preaching can not only be about what the preacher brings to the pulpit. We learn to hear God speaking through listening to the experience of the whole congregation. Let me name one of the comments I read from you that illuminates the significance of sermon sharing. Many of you expressed a longing for practices that help the church truly discern together and not simply think together. And in my experience, preaching can become one of the places where the church discerns together. It includes all the stuff, right? It includes engaging ideas and positions and testing arguments and reflecting critically. And discernment goes further, right? It goes further than thinking because it asks people to listen for the voice of the Spirit in all of the words that are shared. So discernment requires silence and spaciousness. It requires attentiveness to what's emerging and openness to the wisdom woven into people's experiences. So, thinking about preaching as a tool for discernment, if preaching is only about delivering the preacher's insight, then the people in the pews remain recipients more than participants. But when preaching becomes shared work, the community becomes participants in the act of listening for God. And this changes how we understand and practice authority. Authority in preaching. Authority in preaching is one of those tricky things that people either feel really funny about or really weird about, because we have weird relationships to authority. If I was to tell you that as a preacher you are the authority, where does that land? How does that make you feel? Terrified. And we'll stop with that one. Yeah, right, because I know about myself, everything I know about myself, and why would I be a person who has authority? So it's a short walk into imposter syndrome. So what I want to suggest is that authority in preaching that includes sermon sharing shifts from possessing the final word to helping a community listen faithfully for the word together. So I've been talking around it. Let me talk at it. What does sermon sharing actually look like? In my congregation, St. Gregory of Nyssa, there's a form that's been crafted over many years to support group listening and discernment. The first thing that happens is that the preacher delivers a sermon, which is grounded in the best available scholarship. But we ask our preachers to do more than interpret information that they have received through study. We ask them to speak from their own encounter with God. In other words, we ask them to become storytellers. There is generous silence built into the liturgy at St. Gregory's around the sermon. There are 2 minutes of silence after each reading, and there's 1 minute of silence after the sermon itself. We do 2 readings instead of 3 in a Sunday, so that's 5 intentional minutes of silence in the liturgy. Then after this final silence, after the preacher preaches, we invite the congregation to speak. In the earliest version of sermon sharing, which predated me by a whole lot, St. Gregory's discovered that if you simply ask, "What do you think?" you get exactly what you might expect. You get opinions. And opinions, as it turns out, are not especially helpful for discernment. So we made a simple shift in our practice. We began asking people to tell their stories rather than share their opinions. We invited people to talk about what was happening in their lives, and that changed everything. Because, as it turns out, we live in a time that is saturated with opinions, argument, division, outrage, and the constant pressure to defend positions. And opinions often, if not always, narrow imagination instead of opening it up. Opinion can close doors to deeper listening before discernment even begins. And many of you named this reality in your own reflections before coming here. So the question becomes, how do we bridge differences that increasingly fracture not only our civic life, but fracture the body of Christ? And I want to suggest that story has the power to do this. So where opinions close doors, experience opens space. Experience invites curiosity. Experiences allow others to enter in, not by arguing, but by recognizing something of their own lives in the words that they've heard. And then it becomes possible to engage one another with open hearts. Then we may discover that we have something to learn from people we imagined were simply our opponents, or as one of my wonderful parishioners said to me during my doctoral research, I've become genuinely fond of people who annoy the shit out of me. So I mentioned earlier that the preacher tells stories from their own experience of God. Again, this begins alongside the scholarly work of preparing the sermon. So, whether you preach from a manuscript or from notes or more extemporaneously, I want to invite you to begin with this question. Where is the gospel intersecting my life right now? That's where the Spirit is asking us to pay attention. Not, what should I say about the gospel? Not, what is the congregation comfortable with me saying about the gospel? But where am I in the gospel? So take a moment. Think about something in your life that stayed with you recently. Maybe something unresolved, maybe something meaningful. Think about a real experience. Now, if you were to place that experience alongside a gospel text, what would you be listening for? Hope, promise of redemption, wisdom, joy, comfort. Notice what is happening in the room. Instead of starting with an idea, you're starting with your life. You're digging through your experience to come to something about what the Spirit is up to in your life. Not making an argument out of nothing, but creating a conversation with yourself. So when you write that sermon, sometimes the stories that come to you are stories that you don't necessarily think you want to share because they're pretty rough. On Monday, Thursday, I preached a sermon that began, hard to say. On the night before my father died, my brother and I had to wash his body because he'd lost control of his bowels. So we had to get him undressed and in the shower and standing him up and holding him together while the water hit his body. And because he was so sick, he couldn't tell what the temperature of the water was. It felt like it was burning him, even though it was only lukewarm. And I stood and I held my father and I said, I don't know how to do this. And I said, this is what love requires. Which led into talking about foot washing and the commandment of love. And we don't know how to love because it's so hard. It's such a mess. Now, for me, that was the most disclosing sermon I preached at St. Gregory's probably ever. And because it was, it's an easy one to remember. But it is to say that I preached Maundy Thursday services for I don't know how many years. And it's sort of like, okay, we're all going to kneel down, we're going to wash each other's feet. It's going to be weird and blah, 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 blah. And for some reason, I went back to that moment in 2018 when this event happened. And I thought to myself, this is where the gospel is hitting me right now as I come to the conclusion of my ministry, right? So something dying, something difficult, something messy. And then it came to me, I don't know how to do this. And this is what love requires. I don't know how to do this. And this is what love requires. Now, I preached that sermon and man, it was big for me. Most times on a Sunday morning, it's not that big. Most times on a Sunday morning, it is something much more contained and much smaller, and something that has to do with some aspect of whatever it is that the gospel is presenting. I preached about Thomas on the second Sunday of Easter. And Thomas who misses Jesus showing up the first time and, I don't know. I don't believe it until I see it. And I made the point of my own experience, because I'm also an iconographer, that in the Orthodox tradition of iconography, the icon has a title, because all icons have titles in Orthodoxy. And the icon of Thomas is Thomas leaning in, and the center of the icon is a finger. And it's like just about to poke into Jesus' side. And the title of the icon is The Faith of Thomas. Right? Whoop. Zoop, turned it right upside down. Because in that tradition, what we're looking for is not, Thomas is just a guy, just like us, he's kind of a mess. What we're looking for is Thomas endures in his faith. Even though he has trouble believing what it is, he's going to stick his finger into the side of Jesus. So the preacher brings experience, real experience. Then when the preacher is finished, we have a minute of silence, and then the preacher asks this question, or makes this statement. And it's scripted. We say it the same way every week. The word is very near you. It is on your lips and on your hearts. If an experience of your own is close to you now, stand and share it. Listen to each other and listen in the silence, because God is speaking in both. And then the preacher, usually me, will physically move from the place where we preach and stand in the midst of the congregation so that the person who wants to share can take the place of the preacher and then has somebody to look at in the congregation, because, as you know, speaking in public is very scary. So the preacher is standing there as an anchor. And then, the person speaks. Or I make the invitation and we wait. And sometimes there's a great deal of silence. And then sometimes, 3 hands go up at once. But rarely does the silence last for the entire allotted time. Although occasionally it does. Somebody raises their hand, I'll invite them to come forward to speak, and the sermon continues. Almost never does the preacher interrupt the person who's speaking. But because we actually have talked for years and years and years about how this is about stories, if the person starts with an opinion, the preacher might say, excuse me just one second, do you have an experience that you could share that ties to that position? And the person will say, oh yeah, sorry, I forgot. Or not. So that's that's sort of the nuts and bolts of how this happens. We'll listen to, asking some 3 or 4 people to stand up and share. There's only been a couple of times I can count on one hand when the person who stood up said some things that were really problematic. It really matters that the preacher begins by speaking about their own story. It really matters to give a context for people to understand what is this gospel drawing from the preacher. And it's funny because, sometimes the sermon that I prepare just begins with, this thing happened to me that I don't really understand. And what I want to suggest is that preaching is an unfinished theological conversation or an ongoing theological conversation where you're opening up space where other people can share in the same kind of work. And see, I think it all deeply matters because of the kind of church that you described you wanted to see more of. Because if you really believe that the gospel is speaking in people's lives, then that could include the lives of those that are not often heard, those on the margins, those under attack. Which means that if you invite people in your congregation who are not at the very center and the ones who are always being paid attention to and always talking, if you invite them to share, it means solidarity is not just something you preach about. It becomes something that we're listening to in the moment, where we might witness God's wisdom being spoken literally from the margins. Like when Miles, who is sometimes an unhoused member of St. Gregory's, stands up and says, I would like to now speak to you from the position of a poor person, and tells a story. And what's great about that is that it then becomes the moment where preaching begins to form belonging. And a lot of you talked about the church needing to become a place that has real belonging. Not just welcoming people, but actually finding ways that people may belong across differences, across generations, across abilities. And that kind of belonging doesn't happen because, we've got the correct political analysis and then say the right things. It doesn't happen because we want to increase membership by preaching generic encouragement. It doesn't happen because we want people to conform to some shape of church member who is, quote, just like us. It happens because people recognize that their lives matter in the unfolding life of the congregation and in the larger story of God's longing pursuit of us. And when their experiences become part of how the gospel's heard, something just shifts. They're no longer just listening to the sermon, they are a part of it. So sermon sharing has taught me that people do not simply want to be included in the church, they want their lives to matter to the church's hearing of the gospel. And I, can't tell you the number of times that I have preached what I thought was a perfectly decent sermon, only to have somebody say something in sermon sharing that really revealed the depth of the gospel, not just to the congregation, but to me. So I've come to recognize and welcome the fact that my voice is one of many that may speak good news in that room. And I want to be honest with you, it's not neat and tidy work. It's really messy. It's really unpredictable. It sometimes is really frustrating. And sometimes sermon sharing is the thing that terrifies me the most, especially if someone, with whom I have conflict wants to share. I'm like, are they going to call me out? Are they going to scare away a visitor? Are they going to target somebody else in the room? And honestly, in more than 2 decades, I can count on less than one hand how many times I felt that kind of conflict was expressed. But the thing that catches my attention the most in sermon sharing, and in fact, it gets my attention most throughout the liturgy, is silence, which is sorely lacking in many liturgical settings in the Episcopal Church. The silence where nobody says a word. You invite sermon sharing and we're just sitting there and it's like 5 minutes of silence and nobody's saying anything. Everybody's just kind of looking. And then if I can stay in control of my ego and not need to control it all, I can say thank you. Because, preacher's ego, it does exist. So sometimes when I invite sermon sharing and nobody immediately says something, I'm like, was that sermon so bad nobody can connect to it? So I need to soften my grip on that to ask the more interesting question, is the Spirit doing something in the room right now that's beyond my control? And that is generally the case. I love silence. I love silence when it feels like a place where the Spirit is present, and I hate silence when it feels like judgment. So I have to check myself in the midst of silence. I have to breathe through it so that whatever the Spirit's calling forth has a space to emerge. And I have to accept that as the preacher, I am one voice among many that may be speaking gospel. I have to be humble. And many of you expressed a desire to engage doubt, humility, especially with younger generations who are wary of easy answers. And I actually have experienced, and I'll talk more about this at the AI panel, that sermon sharing is a place where this becomes real. Because it's the kind of preaching that makes room for uncertainty. It doesn't push to resolve tension. It trusts that God can be present even in what remains unresolved. So let me tell you a couple of more stories from sermon sharing. Several years ago, there was a member of our parish who's a very articulate, well-spoken woman who stood up to talk about her experience of her father who was in a bad stage of dementia. And she started talking, and as she was talking, she began to weep quietly. And then she stopped talking. And she just stood there for like 3 minutes. And when her voice came back to her, she said, I don't know what to do, but I'm glad I'm in a place where I can stand in tears and not have people trying to fix me. That completed the sermon. Or a time where a high school aged person stood up and came out as trans and talked about her grandmother being unable to accept it. And there was a long silence, and she was in tears. And this person's mother was sitting in the very front row of chairs and was focusing all of her attention and love on her child. And she finished looking, and the person finished speaking and just said, thank you. And that completed the sermon. Or the time a couple of months ago where a 2-year-old was wandering around. Kids wander around at St. Gregory's all the time. And I had noticed the same kid wandering around a couple of weeks before, and I had noticed that one of the elder members of the church was just sort of quietly following the kid around to sort of keep the kids safe. You know, don't pull anything over. And I was talking about that as a model of what it looks like for the congregation to express care. And what I didn't know was the child was like getting up behind me, because we sit to preach at St. Gregory's on this bench, and the child had gotten up behind me, and just as I was talking about her, she said in a really loud voice, "Oh yeah!" And that just about completed the sermon, but I had a few more words to say. And all these times revealed something true about the gospel that I could not have said on my own. So what about authority, and what about clarity, and what about having a moral voice in the public square? I mean, you name those questions too, and they matter. But I would like to suggest that authority in preaching does not come from having the final word. Authority comes from helping a community listen faithfully. And in a time when the church's credibility has been damaged by injustice and abuse and exclusion and disconnection, this kind of listening is not weakness. It's a form of integrity. So let me ask you, when you imagine your future preaching, what are you most afraid of losing? Control, clarity, authority, something else? What are you fretting over? What if I stumble? What if I fall? What if I don't speak clearly? Yeah. Preaching a sermon that no one can connect to. Yeah. And all of the other things that you're thinking of, all of that real stuff, I've had it. I've had that thing. Used to have a friend who said, I had an aunt who, if anybody ever said they had an illness or a sickness, she said, I had that. So I feel the same way about your talking about what you fear in preaching. I had that. And it's true, which is why, I'm a big lover of sermon sharing. So I'll just say that this kind of preaching, sermon sharing preaching can touch that. It can actually bring it up. It can actually add hope to it. Because one of the most courageous, at least in San Francisco, California, one of the most courageous thing people do is just walk into church. Visitors come in and I'm like, thank you so much for being here. I know it took a lot for you to get here. And they're like, how did you know? I was like, because I know. Many of you name younger generations as both a challenge and an opportunity. Generation seeking purpose, community, authenticity. And my experience has been that this kind of preaching meets people there who are there. My experience is that younger generations are not looking for the preacher to perform certainty. And they're not looking for vague religious reassurance. They're looking for the real. More than anything, I find people who want to make a difference in church among younger generations. They want to make a difference in church the way they're making a difference in their own lives, right? Where they're actually honored for their expertise, which is another reason to invite participation. And the truth is, the deep down truth is, I don't know everything that God wants to utter in the sermon. I know what I know. And that knowledge is filtered through the more or less 40 years of preaching and ministry in the Episcopal Church, which is something, but it's not everything. And honestly, and if you're getting to be my age, this is why I look for people in their 20s and 30s to be my mentors. Because I need young mentors now to understand myself and to understand the world. So you also name loneliness, the exhaustion of modern life, the longing for community. I know that in my bones. I know that the preaching life can be profoundly lonely. Again, San Francisco, I didn't realize how socially invisible I was as an Episcopal priest until I moved to the West Coast. Not just sort of losing the small amount of social privilege that still clings to the Southeast and the South as a priest. The first time I got my hair cut in San Francisco, the guy cutting my hair was like, "What do you do for a living?" I was like, "I'm an Episcopal priest." And he said, "Oh, I don't think I've ever heard of that." So that well-practiced cultural trope of the preacher simply didn't exist for him. And of course, that just has deepened over the last 20 years since that happened. So loneliness is real. And again, I think one of the ways that loneliness softens is through sermon sharing, expecting that the stories that friends and strangers bring to the act of preaching may not only build up the body of Christ, but may soften the loneliness that the preacher carries. So this happens when the church becomes a place where people are not just present but known, not just welcome but needed, where good news is shared as part of nothing less than the transformation of life. So perhaps the question is not, how do I write a better sermon, but how do I invite a community into the ongoing work of hearing the gospel in their lives? So let me just leave you with this. The next time you preach, where might you leave the sermon open? Not unfinished in a careless way, but open in a faithful way. Open enough for the Spirit to speak through someone else. Open enough for the gospel to take flesh in ways you could not have planned. Open enough for the community to become with you and despite you a place where beloved community is being found. And if you want to hear preaching from St. Gregory's SF, you can find us on Apple Podcasts and other places. Thank you.